Welcome back to Honored Madman, and today we're going to be talking about madness. Or more specifically, though, we're going to talk about the origins of the Flame of Frenzy and just what exactly is it. I recently talked about Vike and Shabriri in part 1 of this whole Frenzy series thing I'm doing. It's just going to be 2 parts. And they're definitely going to be mentioned again in some capacity in this video, but I'm mainly going to focus on what exactly the Flame of Frenzy is and where did it come from, all of that good stuff. So without further ado, let's have an intro since we haven't had one of those in a while. So the Flame of Frenzy appears to be an aspect or an avatar of an outer god known as the One Great. As far as I can tell, outer gods on the whole appear to be very powerful entities that occasionally try to take control of the lands between. They're extremely mysterious and powerful and are able to easily influence the minds of men, and also a couple demigods. Their influence and powers may vary, but some are able to quite literally alter the environment with their influence, or at the very least with the influence of their followers. We see this with Caelid and the Lake of Rot, courtesy of the old Rot outer god, or Mogwyn Palace and presumably all of the Land of Reeds with the Formless Mother, the Blood god. The One Great is a bit different. It's still capable of altering the environment and changing people's minds. I guess the better term would be melting people's minds, but I digress. The One Great uniquely claims to be the source of all life and everything in the world. It claims to have created everything. At least according to the words of the Three Fingers as interpreted by Hyetta and presumably Shabriri as well. She tells it far better than I ever could.
I have touched them. The words of the Three Fingers. As your maiden, allow me to divine them. All that there is came from the One Great. Then came fractures, and births, and souls. But the greater will made a mistake. Torment, despair, affliction, every sin, every curse, every one born of the mistake. And so, what was borrowed must be returned, melted all away with the yellow chaos flame, until all is one again.
There it is, straight from the blind horse's mouth. Now, as always, the One Great could be lying to its followers, he could be lying to all of us, but let's still pick apart this dialogue anyway. First off, there's 2 things that stand out here to me. Well, the whole thing stands out, but 2 things specifically. It uses the term borrowed in regards to whatever the Greater Will took from the One Great, which despite all of the contempt it has for the Greater Will, the One Great does not consider the Greater Will a thief, and probably blames itself for loaning whatever it was to the Greater Will in the first place. Definitely been there before. And it's likely that whatever this borrowed thing was what the Greater Will used to take over the lands between and alter the very world logic itself. Stuff like deciding the Misbegotten and the Omen and, well, even death itself weren't part of its new order, so naturally all those things had to go. But Hyetta also mentions that the Greater Will is responsible for all of the births, or the births in question could just be referring to everything that was born from the Greater Will, and this Golden Order is what needs to be melted away and purged and kind of shaped back into the whole that was once the One Great. Or it means that birth didn't really exist in its, at least the form we know it, during the Crucible of Life, if its story is to be believed. But I think it's safer to assume that the births in question were just things that came from the Golden Order and Greater Will that need to be burnt away. The other thing that stands out is that it's like taking credit for all the good in the world, but also blaming the Greater Will for all the bad that happens in the world. But it's not responsible for all the suffering that happens, and that might be partly true. I mean, the Greater Will is obviously the source of a lot of suffering. Look at the Omens, the Misbegotten, the Demi-Humans. Anyone who doesn't fit into their Golden Order pretty much gets the shit end of the stick. But on the flip side of that, burning away the entire world and everybody in it, even in its fractured state, all because you're feeling a little sad and some, charismatic disembodied spirit told you so. I mean, first off, it's a bit of a dick move. And yeah, that's probably going to cause a lot of suffering too, so maybe you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. The Omen and Misbegotten sure are. Although there was a certain demigod that was creating an island of broken toys sort of place for them to all go live together happily. But until we play that DLC, that doesn't appear to have worked out too well for him. Unless the whole union with Mog and the Formless Mother was all part of his grand scheme all along. That Mikola, he's what's called a mysterious one. As always, though, I'm getting off subject a little bit. Now, even if we are being lied to, this supposed one grade is clearly banking on us reading some of the various item descriptions found throughout the game, specifically the ones pertaining to the primordial crucible of life and the great tree. It calls itself the source of all life in the world, and it also has great in its name. It's sort of positioning itself as whatever entity the great tree was representing back during the Crucible days. We're told that the Crucible was the Erd tree before it was the Erd tree. And what if that's actually not a lie, but also not the whole truth? Because if the One Great is in fact the Crucible, or the primeval entity that created the Crucible, and the Greater Will broke off from it during this rather tumultuous time, and then went on to create the Erd Tree, then I guess the Crucible would in fact be the Erd Tree in its primordial state, but also originally a different entity entirely. The Greater Will is a lot like Radagon or Quentin Tarantino, in that it takes things from the previous era, flips them around a little bit, and then presents them as his own genius creation. Radagon himself does this with the Carian sorceries and the Academy of Rey Lucaria by creating fundamentalist incantations. Similarly, the Golden Order employs death rite rituals learned from the Deathbirds themselves to make their mausoleum guardians functionally undead or partially immortal, and it only costs them their heads. I mean, shit, the Greater Will only uses the Erd Tree as its mascot because the Great Tree conveniently had roots that stretched all across the lands between, which would go on to serve the Greater Will's own purposes, and the previous age also had a thing for trees too, so that was also pretty convenient for them. I'd imagine it'd be pretty easy to get people to start worshipping a tree if they'd already been doing it for God knows how long, especially if this new tree started to light up and glow the way it does. It makes perfect sense to me. It really does start looking like that the Greater Will and the Golden Order, and even the Erd Tree, are just, for better or worse, bastardized versions of the Great Tree, the One Great, and the Crucible of Life that came before it. And I think that's important when it comes to understanding just what the Flame of Frenzy is, if its story is indeed true, or at the very least, partially true. Anyway, back to the One Great story. It's also clearly counting on us finding out about the various flaws within the Greater Will and the Golden Order. The quote-unquote curse of the omen, undeath, and whatever Goldmask was trying to fix about it. We know that during the primordial crucible, which was supposedly the primeval state of the Erd Tree, there were various instances of life through death and also humans with horns, and also scales and tails, two things that the Greater Will, through the Golden Order, specifically tried to delete out of existence, only for them all to show back up and be labeled as a curse of some kind and have specialized orders of warriors dedicated to their eradication. Look at the Omen Killers and the Hunters of the Undead. So these are the supposed mistakes that the Greater Will made when it supposedly broke off from this One Great. None of this proves whether the story of the One Great is true or just a well-fabricated lie, but let's keep exploring it anyway. One thing I want to specify though is we don't really know whether Hyetta means the whole world or just the lands between when it comes to the One Great creating everything and all of that. That could then imply that it also created the other outer gods that were vying for power during the Crucible, but I don't think that's the case. I think that it was just the dominant power in its weird-ass primordial form, and that the Greater Will broke off from it and presumably killed it, and then proceeded to create its own world logic with its vassal goddess. Now, I don't know how the Greater Will would have gone about killing the One Great, this divine entity, if that's exactly what it was or not. But it could be that they just both spawned avatars and the Elden beasts beat whatever avatar that the One Great summoned. And when this One Great's avatar was defeated, the One Great itself was effectively banished from the lands between, and any trace of it was eradicated and labeled madness. Or actually, more accurately, blasphemy. Although blasphemy sort of describes a lot of things in the lands between. Now, if I wanted to get really tinfoil hatty, I would say that perhaps the remains of the One Great were discovered by the Nox, and then they proceeded to craft the Fingerslayer blade, and that's what earned them the scorn of the Greater Will. Not much to back it, but it would make sense. Honestly though, anything that the Nox were doing could have earned them the Golden Order's wrath, so that one's just as likely as any of the others. Now again, I think that even if the One Great story is mostly true, that it doesn't actually mean it created the whole world, and that it's really only referring to the shit that's going on in the lands between, unless the primordial crucible was like Pangea, and it was everything, all the continents were connected, and everything was one big thing, and then whatever the greater will did caused the continents to separate, like a sort of Big Bang type of thing, and then when the dust settled, the Erd Tree was what was left, after America's various conquests against the other powers in the lands between at the time. But all of that is some shit I can dissect in another video. Anyways though, if the One Great was defeated by the greater will and pretty much eradicated from the lands between, how did it return? Well, we talked about this in the last one, that my going theory was originally that Shabriri essentially used some merchants to spread around the blight after he discovered this fingerprint shield, which was like this stone slab that I'm assuming told the very same story that Hyetta tells us at the end of her quest line. Now, who the fuck knows how Shabriri got his hands on this mysterious slab? But I do have a going theory. I'm not sure about the exact timeline of events, but I think when the One Great is defeated, that its remains are placed into some coffin, and then the coffin is then discovered by the Nox, who then use it to build this Fingerslayer blade, but they're eventually destroyed for creating the Fingerslayer blade. I'm assuming that when the Nox civilization was destroyed, that most of the coffin was also destroyed if they even had any of it left, but that one piece managed to survive, and this mysterious one piece was then found by Shabriri, who may have even been a Nox himself. That's, I guess, possible, but I'm not thinking it's very likely. And he managed to interpret this story. Now, I don't actually think that Shabriri became frenzied after reading this. I don't even think that the frenzy even existed at this point, at least not in the form that we know it as. Aside from relaying this tale about how it supposedly got fucked over, I think it also compelled Shabriri to essentially summon it back, resurrect it back into the lands between, so we could get revenge on the greater will. And to this end, Shabriri sought out the nomadic merchant clan and spread his story to all of them. Now again, I don't think that they became frenzied either. These guys don't use frenzy until they're very near death if you engage combat with them, which is probably due to the fact that they don't feel that despair and hopelessness until they're right about to die. It's in that moment that they become frenzied. And I don't think the frenzy, again, existed at this point yet. But when the Golden Order caught wind of these merchants going around saying that the greater will was actually created from the One Great and yada yada yada, everything you know is a lie, the Golden Order did what it did best and labeled this madness, and then punished the entire merchant clan, or almost all of them, accordingly, by burying them away underneath the capital, sealing this story away out of fear for what might follow it. And this turned out to be exactly what Shabriri wanted. He presumably needed to recreate the same feeling of hopelessness, grief, and despair that the One Great felt when it had its power ripped from it and was killed by its, offspring, the Greater Will. And to do that, he needed an entire nation of people to begin chanting a song of despair. The merchants really did get the raw end of this deal. All these dudes presumably did wrong was learn a little story or two from a guy who looked like he was from ancient Greece. He was probably pretty charismatic, that Shabriri, and share that story with other travelers on the road, resulting in word getting back to the Golden Order and them, getting pretty much genocided. There's also the possibility that he didn't interpret or translate any sermons from the stone slab and that he just traded it to the merchants because, they are merchants. And it was likely the nomad's curiosity that would do most of Shabriri's work for him. And the trade makes sense since they are merchants who travel. Although as to where Shabriri found the stone slab, I really don't have much of an idea. I guess it's possible that he was like a laborer for some archaeologists and discovered the stone slab amongst some rubble, like the beginning of Transformers or The Fifth Element. That style scene? Obviously, I'm not sold on this whole little idea, but it's definitely worth mentioning, I think. It makes sense to me. Sell a group of nomads a sort of mysterious artifact. Maybe he went full snake oil merchant and used his charisma skill to sell these merchants what appears to be a useless stone slab in exchange for some. Maybe he just gave it to him because he needed the frenzy to spread, or the idea of it to spread. So I guess this stone slab, him giving it to the merchants, is sort of like the inception of the Flame of Frenzy, in a way. At least in its current yellowy, fiery form, that is. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. Now, personally, I believe this chant of despair is what actually summoned the Flame of Frenzy into existence and allowed Frenzy, or the blight, to take root in the lands between. And if all of this is true, then it would make the Flame of Frenzy a sort of vengeful spirit god, essentially the wraith of the Great Tree, or the wraith of the Crucible, that's come back to quite literally burn everything away since it no longer has control. I think this is sort of backed up by Shabriri's woe's item description. It says that he had his eyes gouged out for the crime of slander, and that over time, eventually, the yellow flame of frenzy began to reside in his empty eye sockets. So first off, that tells me that he didn't go through the usual process that people do when they experience frenzy. I think it starts with the eyes turning yellow. We see this in some of the frenzied rats. Then they become inflamed, eventually turning into Shabriri grapes. I imagine this is when they're in the full onset of the blight, or the sickness of frenzy. After a while, though, the eyes eventually burst and become one of those yellow embers you might commonly find in frenzied lands. So that tells me that even though he was the mastermind, original frenzy man, he didn't start off with frenzy when he supposedly committed his crime of slander, which I believe was just teaching those words to the merchants, before the frenzy had actually taken root in the lands between. That's why after he was caught and immediately had his eyes scooped out, he didn't immediately get fire eyes. But once the merchants had been buried and began chanting their song of despair and, summoning the flame, that's when I'd imagine the flames began residing in Shabriri's empty eye sockets. They probably kept the guy in like the darkest cell of the darkest dungeon, and one day they go in there to check on him and see that his eyes are now two little yellow fires, which is pretty cool. Now, how it began spreading across the lands between post-Chant of Despair is really just, I guess, kind of obvious. Look around, the lands between are a kind of hopeless place. You don't necessarily need to know the story of the Three Fingers and the One Great to succumb to frenzy, and that's really the kicker. Because as we've seen, you can know the true story or the supposed true story of the One Great and not succumb to frenzy, but if you ever find yourself particularly hopeless and despairing, then you are more than likely to succumb to it. There's also a good chance that rats helped the spread of the blight across the lands between, since outside of humans and the occasional troll, rats appear to be the only other species of creature that's able to become afflicted with the frenzied sickness, and I'd imagine they potentially can spread it to their little rat colonies, which then travel across the lands between, spreading it to other rat colonies, and then when they bite people, maybe it spreads to the people. Maybe it's like a plague tale, which is actually a game I've yet to play, but I probably will play it at some point. It looks pretty interesting. But anyway, I figure now is as good a time as any to quickly explain how this whole quote-unquote sickness of frenzy works. So ever since that sad band of fiddlers played their song of despair and summoned the flame of frenzy into existence in the lands between, the sickness has been able to take root naturally in individuals under the right circumstances. This usually means the individual has to feel intense feelings of loneliness, despair, hopelessness, and anguish for the onset of the frenzy sickness to truly begin. The afflicted begins to feel the crawling of insects on their skin, and they begin to hear them at times, as we see with our dear friend Bloody Finger Hunter Yura. I imagine around this time the eyes begin to yellow a bit, but they don't fully turn into grapes until, well, they've fully succumbed. Some individuals have tried to fight this sickness and even control it and use its power for their own purposes, although it's said that every single one of those individuals eventually succumbed to the frenzy after an intense personal struggle with what the teenagers would call their inner demons. The frenzy also seems to be somewhat contagious and can be passed from one individual to the other, and as we already talked about, the rats definitely probably helped this spread. But it makes you wonder though, did the rats catch it from the humans? Like, is it the other way around? Did the humans spread their plague to the rats? Or are rats in the lands between capable of feeling despair and hopelessness? I mean, I guess it wouldn't surprise me. But the likely answer for why the rats are afflicted with the frenzy is probably because they were eating the eyes of Yellow. You know those red branches full of weird-looking eye-like fruits? They're only found in frenzy-afflicted lands, and Jarberg. It's said to be prized for its pain-relieving properties, although it doubles as a dangerous intoxicant. So it's safe to assume that these rats were just trying to get high as fuck, and one of the side effects of that was becoming frenzied. And as we know, when someone has finally succumbed to the flame of frenzy, their eyeballs burst out of their heads, leaving yellow embers behind either in their eye sockets or on the ground, and they now walk around with the flame of frenzy in their eyes. The individuals with Shabriri grape eyes, I imagine, have also succumbed, but are considered ripe. People like Edgar and even Vike, Now, it's also possible that they haven't fully succumbed yet and that one doesn't until the eyes burst, but I think at that point there's really no saving them. I mean, once your eyes are Shabriri grapes, you're pretty much fucked. There's no going back from that. It's only going to get worse from there. The eyes just aren't full-on flames yet. Anyway, though. But look, as far as I can tell, the One Great was killed by the Greater Will and then came back as this vengeful spirit or demon of the One Great in order to burn the lands between and destroy the Greater Will for, revenge. Or the Flame of Frenzy is just lying about this supposed noble origin just to fool us into helping it out. It's really one or the other. Like I said, it's either the truth or a really well-constructed lie. But before we go today, there's something in my last video I wanted to talk about regarding everybody's favorite Tarnished, at least Lanisax's favorite Tarnished, Vike. So for the sake of making this video a little bit longer, let's recap on just who Vike is. Now, long before becoming a cautionary tale for the Tarnished, Vike was a warrior of the Round Table Hold, or I guess a knight would be a better word to use. Now, as we all know, the original Round Table Hold was located in Leyndell, which was also where the Dragon Cult was located, led by the famous archdragon Lanisax. Vike was a member of this cult and he was Lanisax's favorite, that's why we call him the Dragon Fucker. But despite his status, he, like all Tarnished, was sent away along with their lord Godfrey into the lands beyond the lands between to go off and fight and die. Unfortunately, there's no artwork or slide of what happened to him out in the Badlands like there is for like Gideon getting buried with all the ears and Dung Eater getting dung flung at him. Honestly, all those artworks are great. Godfrey's is probably the best, but I really like how it's like Fia waking up next to a dead guy. I would like to get an oil painting of that one. It just seems like something you'd see in like an old mansion in Italy or something. But I'm getting off subject. We don't really know what became of Vike in the Badlands or the lands outside the lands between when he was banished alongside his lord, but we do know that after the Shattering, he, like all the Tarnished, eventually showed back up in the lands between, where he, like many of the other prominent Tarnished, were assigned a Finger Maiden to help them become the next Elden Lord, to effectively succeed Godfrey in a way. Little did they all know that Godfrey had also come back. It can be assumed that he was one of the first Tarnished to return to the lands between, or at the very least he showed up much earlier than us, the player. Now all was going good for Vike, and many believed he was going to be the next Elden Lord, but that's when something happened. He was supposedly led astray by Shabriri himself. See, Shabriri had figured out that the only way they could truly melt away the world like the One Great wanted to was to circumvent the intricate system that the Golden Order and Greater Will had set up, involving success. To this end, he would need to manipulate a Tarnished into doing his bidding. But first he would need to find a reason to lead them to believe that it was in their best interest, or the best interest of someone they loved, for them to travel deep beneath Leyndell and inherit an eldritch flame. And what better way to do that than putting a helpless damsel in distress and setting the stage for a hero to make their sacrifice for them. And who better a person for it to happen to than Vike, the heroic knight that everybody believed was going to be the next Elden Lord just because of how badass he was. I mean, this guy fucks dragons. And for me, this is where things get a little bit muddy. Because as far as we know, there's only one Kindling Maiden. That's Melina, and she was able to burn the Erd Tree and ultimately help us become the Elden Lord. However, all the other Tarnished that received a maiden, they received what's called a Finger Maiden. Now, were these Finger Maidens capable of burning the Erd Tree if their Tarnished had brought them all the way to the Flame Peak? Personally, I don't think so, but maybe they could, maybe they couldn't. And I don't know if Shabriri knew that or not, but him mentioning that being the Maiden's purpose, the one that was serving Vike, could be hinting that he knows the existence of a Kindling Maiden and her purpose, and possibly knows that Vike's isn't a Kindling Maiden and is just a Finger Maiden, and is therefore being duplicitous as fuck. Me personally, I don't think Shabriri knows about the existence of Melina, but I do think he knows a lot more than he's letting on, or at least that he let on to Vike. I think at the end of the day, he didn't really know whether or not the Finger Maiden was capable of burning the Erd Tree. Although he is a lot older than Vike, maybe he'd seen it happen before and knew that it just wouldn't work and was kinda actually helping Vike out in a way, sparing his maiden from a pointless death for her to ultimately, spoiler alert, die one anyway. But yeah, I don't think Shabriri knew whether or not the Finger Maiden was capable of burning. I think that he was just like, yo, here's a for sure way you could burn it yourself, and that way your maiden doesn't have to die. And he knew somebody like Vike was going to be all for that idea. Now again, here's where things get interesting. Vike went down there and inherited the flame, but he didn't really do it correctly. See, for whatever reason, maybe the door didn't have the requirement of getting naked before you opened it this time, but Vike was wearing armor when the Flame of Frenzy fingers embraced him. That is, judging by the fingerprints smashed into his trademark fingerprint armor. Yeah, it appears he was fully armored when he went down there, maybe as a sort of precaution so it wouldn't consume his mind or anything. Or again, this was a long time ago, maybe that wasn't a requirement, maybe you didn't have to get naked, and after this sort of inheritance not taking was when they made the rule for you to have to get naked if you wanted to inherit the flame, so there was no complications. Now, as we all know, this would have tragic consequences for Vike. Presumably, he would come back down to the lands between, specifically Liurnia, and tell his maiden what he'd done, that he'd spared her from this gruesome fate of burning to death for a pointless reason. And here's where possibilities kind of ensue. Now, she was either dead by the time he got back, which is definitely possible, or she died from exposure to Vike because he was now frenzied to all hell. I mean, his fucking spear emanates frenzy through walls. The guy's like a glowing one feral ghoul from Fallout, but with frenzy. Or she, unalived herself because she was horrified at what Vike had done to save her from what I imagine was a fate that she willingly accepted, even if it was gruesome and pointless. And where does that leave Vike? Well, heartbroken probably. We don't know if when he came back to life and returned to the lands between, if he ever visited Landsax again, but if he did, I imagine it was right around here. Now, there's not much to back this other than the fact that his phantom attacks you here, and there's the whole Eye of Sauron and the really high frenzy content in this area, the Frenzied Flame Village where he invades at. But I believe Vike cut out his eye because only one of his eyes had gone all frenzy and Shabriri grape, the fingerprint eye, and he left that and his frenzied spear behind, and then basically sought out Lamsax to help purge whatever remained of the partially inherited flame of frenzy from his body, and then to give him a ride to the mountaintops of giants where he would sort of just imprison himself as punishment for his actions of, helping spread the blight of the frenzied flame along throughout the lands between, helping this eldritch entity establish a rather large foothold in Liurnia, specifically the land that the Golden Order and the Greater Will had the least amount of influence in. I definitely don't think that that's a coincidence. But the fact that he invades there, I really do think that it's his eye or the spear that's sort of creating this evil phantom of all of his frenzied self that was purged out and left behind. And that due with the very high amount of frenzied shit in the area. I mean, we have a literal Eye of Sauron not far from where he invades. Plus, this chapel is also the location of where his maiden's corpse is, probably the greatest source of all of his grief, despair, and hopelessness. I think it's also very possible that he did succumb, but managed to call up Lanistax to help him out and just fly him over to the Everjail, and that there's no frenzy in Everjail realm, so that when we fight him, he's not capable of using his frenzy moves anymore. He's just sort of his true self fighting one last time, one last good fight, like that quote at the end of that movie The Grey, which in my opinion gets a bad rap. It's a pretty decent movie. Take that, Dan Harmon. But I do think that the real reason that this area is so saturated with the blight of the frenzy and the whole Eye of Sauron and all that is because that it was here that Vike, the inheritor or halfway inheritor of the actual flame of frenzy, felt the most anguish in his life and likely finally succumbed to true frenzy and experienced it. Or again, half experienced it because only one of his eyes went all frenzy-like. Maybe he sent out some kind of frenzy fucking shockwave. That'd be kind of cool, like just one pulse of frenzy and it just kind of hit that entire village, turning it into Frenzy Village 1. Or I guess it would technically be Frenzy Village 2 because Ailing Village would be Frenzy Village 1, but I digress. But yeah, I mean, it was here that he realized likely that he'd been tricked by Shabriri and that he had actually just saved nobody and made the world a worse place despite having the noblest intentions at heart. I can't imagine that he felt anything other than despair and anguish. So, I have a couple of theories when it comes to Vike. I have to thank a specific commenter, though, for commenting this really long write-up on my last Frenzy video that pointed out it is probably his eye that is the source of his phantom, and I definitely agree. Maybe it's the eye and the spear, you know what I mean? I'd have to fight Evergel Vike again to see if he's using his actual Frenzy spear or if he's just using a regular partisan. Not that it matters, it's just a detail I find interesting. I also want to thank, I think, the same commenter, but it might have been a different one. It's been a really long fucking 11 or 12 days for me, for pointing out that Vike didn't fully inherit the Flame of Frenzy because he was wearing his armor and all of that. That's a great insight. I can't believe I didn't think of that, but very much kudos to you. You're getting a thank you in the video for that, because that was a great... Some of the major conclusions I managed to come to in this video wouldn't have been possible without some of the insights I learned from that comment. It made me re-look into some of the things and reinterpret some item descriptions. That's why I kind of put this revised Vike section in the video. It definitely felt necessary. But where does that leave our man Vike? Well, ultimately it makes him look a little sad and pathetic compared to someone like, say, Bernal, who I've also done a video about. Now this guy was the definition of Chad energy. I mean, his last line of dialogue to us is that God itself is going to fall to his blade. And I mean, come on, how do you kill a god? What a grand and intoxicating innocence. The guy just oozes badass, but it doesn't make Vike any less compelling, the fact that there's this guy Bernal who's like a lot cooler and was just overall more badass than him. Vike is still a very important and interesting character. He's just not as cool as he was made out to be, in my opinion. But as far as the Tarnished go, he is definitely one of their best. It's just unfortunate that he was led astray in such a way. It's also worth noting that the One Great's use of Shabriri to manipulate the Greater Will and Golden Order's systems is not an isolated incident. In fact, they're also exploring other avenues that involve using the Greater Will's own systems of succession against it. Like, for example, we see this in Hyetta's quest. Whether or not she's a reanimated Irina is sort of irrelevant. The purpose of her quest is to sort of guide the player to the Frenzied Flame prescription and offer this alternative take on the Flame of Frenzy, or rather an alternative understanding, maybe even a better understanding of this eldritch entity. And through this, they create their very own Finger Maiden. The regular Finger Maidens guide their Tarnished to the Flame of Ruin, and this one guides us to the Flame of Frenzy, which I guess is a sort of a metaphorical Morpheus moment. I think that's probably why I like Hyetta's quest and how she fits into the lore so much. I mean, shit, half of this video is me citing some of her final dialogue, or some of the dialogue she has throughout her quest line. I mean, we learn a good chunk of what we know about the Frenzy from Hyetta. And as for the Frenzied at Yellow Annex Ruins, I'm assuming Mikola maybe offered them a place in his consecrated snowfield because they don't seem to be the mindless type of Frenzieds. They appear to have organized patrols around their Shadow Moses style base, and the place is heavily secured. There's a bunch of frenzied trolls running around wearing cloaks. Basically the toughest variant of troll, so you're in for it if you want to fight all those guys. There's of course a little horde of blighted rats, and round-the-clock patrols from frenzied peasants wielding spears. It's almost like they're guarding something. Did they perhaps capture that Estelle beast deep in the depths of Yellow Annex tunnels, and are keeping it under heavy lock and key, perhaps at the request of Mikola? Maybe. That's just some last-minute speculation I wanted to get in, though. Could be, though. Could be. Now that I'm thinking about it a little bit, it was probably the Elden Ring, or at least the primordial version of it that the Greater Will stole from the One Great. I could be wrong, but that seems to make sense as far as I could tell. Maybe there'll be a video in the future called What is the Elden Ring exactly? I think it's just the fabric of reality itself, but I definitely need to reread some descriptions. But yeah. That's about really all I had to say about all of this, but I wanted to say sorry about that long delay. It's been about 12 days since my last upload. It was definitely not supposed to be that long. It's just life, keeps side busting me. But we should be back at our regularly scheduled programming. There might be a rant video that gets thrown in sooner or later, but my next big one is going to be the Radagon is a science project video. I know you guys are all waiting for that one. That one should be done pretty soon. I've been kind of working on it in the background for a while now. But enough with all that. I hope you guys found this video at least somewhat entertaining and informative, and if you liked it, please like it. If you dislike it, please dislike it. And if you like hearing me rant about lore or video games or just regular rants about random shit, please consider subscribing. Really helps the channel out. And if you want to follow me on anything else, the only social media I really use is my Honored Madman account on Instagram, and it's really just to post updates, and really just, it's honestly just a glorified shitposting account that I post updates on. So if you're into that, please follow that. It's on Instagram. That's Honored Madman at Instagram, I guess. But without further ado, let us have that outro we've all been waiting for since we had the intro. On an unrelated note, from the videos I mentioned in that poll that are all on the way, there's a Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker video I've been working on, because to my absolute surprise of struggling to get Metal Gear Solid 4 to work on our PCS3, Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker runs amazingly on it. Now personally, I love that game, so I've been working on something in the background about that. It's not really done because I need to run through the game a little more to get proper footage, but I expect that at some point. I know I promised a lot of stuff like Fallout videos, Zelda videos, and they're all coming. I just have to get all this footage compiled. Elden Ring was easy because I had all this footage from playing it since it came out. And other games, I never really took clips a lot while I was playing. I guess that's on me. So now I have to like replay every game ever to get clips. But hey, I'm not complaining. That's, what is that? That's first world problems, as cringe as that term is. Anyway, I've ranted long enough. You guys have a good one. I will see you next time.
Hello? Is someone there? My name is Hyetta, and I'm journeying in search of the distant light. If I might be so bold as to ask, would you donate any Shabriri grapes in your possession to me? My eyesight has been weak since birth, you see. I can't tell which way I'm supposed to go next, but when I eat one of those grapes, I can feel a distant light in the back of my eyes. It will lead me to my true duty as a finger maiden. Oh, many thanks to you. Now I can feel the distant light once more. You are most kind indeed. May the blessing of the fingers be upon you.
I really like how the Frenzied Flame village had that yellow cloth banner in the middle of it to indicate that the village had fallen to the frenzy. It's just like a rudimentary yellow cloth banner. I don't think there's one at the Ailing village, but there might be, and I don't think there's one at Yellow Annex Ruins. So that tells me that it was put up there by the soldiers, and look at me still going on at the end of the video. You guys have a good one.
If you intend to claim the Frenzied Flame, I ask that you cease. It is not to be meddled with. It is chaos, devouring life and thought unending. However ruined this world has become, however mired in torment and despair, life endures. Births continue. There is beauty in that, is there not? If you would become Lord, do not deny this notion. Please, leave the Frenzied Flame alone. I ask you one more time, please, seek not the Frenzied Flame. As one who strives to become a lord, deny not the lives, the new births of this world. Those who would are not fit to be called lord, when the land they preside over is lifeless. Please, put a stop to this madness. The Lord of Frenzied Flame is no lord at all.